Hello everybody and welcome to Mrs. G's Storytime. We are reading the book I Needed a Neighbor by Patricia St. John with permission of Scripture Union Publications, and we are on Chapter 5. Merritt and Tekla lay asleep, covered by a skin, and their grandparents squatted beside them, mourning their daughter and trying to decide what to do. "They must go back," said the grandfather. He was an old man with a bald head and stick-like legs. He was a clever farmer, but he had sold his ox to buy the last store of grain, and he knew that the end was not far off. "Back to what?" asked the grandmother. "They cannot live alone. There is food in the town, and the neighbors are kind. If they stay here, they will die. We cannot feed them." "They won't stay here. Didn't you tell me the village was leaving, and that they were meeting tomorrow to talk about traveling west? Let them travel with us, and somewhere further on we can make a new home together." He glanced at her, unwilling to put his thoughts into words. He had thought that she would have known. "We are old," he said gently. "How can we travel so fast and so far? There are still small stores of grain in the village, and we can still reach the river. I think the old will stay." Grandmother shook her head. "The children are strangers, and they cannot eat from the village grain store. I am still strong, and we will follow the trail to the camps. Let us all go together." He straightened his bent old back and smiled at her. "If that is your wish, then we will go," he said, for although she was old and almost toothless, he still loved her very much. Out west it was said that there was food, but there was also war and sniping on the roads. Ah, well, with drought and famine in the village there was little to lose, especially now that his daughter had been taken. Then his gaze rested on the sleeping children, and he checked his tired thoughts. For their sake they must live for a time and be strong. He was a peasant, and he knew that the old stalks wither and die only that the seed may be scattered and grow, but they die gracefully, with dignity and without protest. Indeed, he knew there was even beauty in the last golden leaves, but nothing mattered except the new sprouting. He and his wife lay down together on the rope bed and slept peacefully, their minds made up. The children woke refreshed and hungry, and Merritt took the water pot and went to the river in the deep ravine, which had still not dried up. It was a good 2 hours' walk, and scrambling down over the shard and the rock, but the other women and children went with her, and the mountain air was still fresh and cool. Because of the ravine into which the high snows trickled, their village had not perished like the other villages. They had not been able to plow or sow, but they had been able to cultivate sorghum in the shade of their houses, and toiling to and fro to sprinkle it with water. But now the great twig-woven vats were nearly empty, and there was no harvest, for it was 5 years since the rains had fallen. Even if the small rains came in February, they would not survive until the crops ripened. Merritt and Tekla had arrived just in time. The official permission had been given to leave, and that very morning a meeting had been called, and everyone in the village would attend. Merritt climbed back to the house to find her grandmother crouched over a small fire, making injera with some of the sorghum that the girl had brought from the town, and her soldier son lay on the mud ledge beside her. He had come from the rebel forces in the mountain strongholds and had walked all night, but he sat up when he saw his niece and greeted her courteously. Tekla climbed into his lap and gazed almost worshipfully at his gun. Grandmother blew out the fire, for every scrap of firewood was precious, and divided the injera carefully between them, keeping the small portion for herself. As they ate, they talked. Her son Gabri had come to organize the journey and guide them on their way to the first rest camp, for there were few young men left in the villages. He was tall and strong, but the bones of his face stuck out sharply, and he was very thin. His dark eyes flashed with anger when he heard what had happened to his sister and her husband, but he tried to comfort the children. "All is not lost, little ones," he said. "Some have escaped over the borders and returned. You too must escape over the border, and who knows, some day, somewhere, you may meet again." Then he added a quick aside. "They were fools to go to the distribution. Nobody young and strong and in their senses goes there any more. He should have sent the children. They wouldn't have taken them." There was a stir in the little village. People were coming from the houses, mostly the old, the women, and the children. They were a haggard lot, and the children were quiet and listless. Some had bald spots in their hair, and many hung their heads, for their eyes were inflamed and sensitive to the light. But they all came, pouring from their round stone huts to gather in front of the little church where the priest was ringing a cracked bell. It was the priest who addressed them first, a thin old man who leaned on his stick. He told them what they already knew, that they could no longer stave off famine and wait for the rains. The official paper had come, and they must pack up their possessions they could carry and set off together. They could turn east to the government-held towns, which were nearer and where food was available, or they would start off on a long march west to a more uncertain food supply. They must decide. There was no hesitation in their choice. The western road might be long and dangerous, but to the east, people disappeared and parents were bundled into lorries and children were left behind. They would go west. The women and the older men would carry the little ones, and the older children would carry the bundles, and they would start just before sunset. Gabriel then took over and exclaimed that it was better to travel by night. They were highland dwellers, unused to the low land heat, and in any case the roads were not safe by day, because the enemy troops sent planes that swooped down to shoot down columns of travelers. Many had died, he told them, men, women, and children, but he had come to guide them, and he knew the way over the mountain, and it was not too far to the first rest camp. There was a dead silence as some families turned to their own parents and grandparents, already weakened by hunger, and rigorously self-denial, for it was always the children who must live. Some had trotted weakly, some leaned on sticks, but still there was some grain in the village and a small store of seed, and surely the rains would come soon. Some who could not make the long journey could still walk to the water. Merritt leaned against her grandmother. "Tikla and I will stay with you," she whispered. "We cannot leave you and go alone. We will draw water for you." "Your grandfather and I are coming," replied the old woman with great spirit. "God will give us the strength, and we will stay together." It was a sad, sad sunset. Everyone collected in front of the church, carrying a blanket, a mat, a cooking pot, a water pot, and together they ate and drank, so quietly that the meal seemed almost sacramental. Each had a small store of grain for the journey, and as they journeyed west they might find edible roots and grasses. All that could be gathered in the way of food or firewood had been left behind for the few old people who stood uncomplaining and unprotesting, for they had lived through famines before, and they knew. Their children embraced them weeping, and the priest blessed them, and the straggling convoy set off. When Merritt turned into the bottom of the hill, the last ray of sun still shone on them, standing desolate, waving farewell. And certainly the trail they followed that night through the hills was not for the very old or very young. They kept their eyes on Gabriel's bobbing lantern, and the new moon gave a little light, but many of them suffered from night blindness and stumbled on the rocks or slid on the shale. They rested in the daytime, sheltering under rocks, drawing water where they might from rivers that had almost dried up, where the pools were cloudy and muddy. The boys collected firewood to cook the rapidly diminishing supplies of sorghum. Other groups of migrants joined them from other villages, but no one talked much or exchanged news, or the children soon ceased to play or chatter. Sometimes two would start a conversation, but soon they would seem to fall asleep in the middle of a sentence. Yet when evening came, they would rise up doggedly and set off along the trail. Merritt's heart sank whenever she looked at Tikla. He seemed fatter than before, but it was not a healthy fatness. His stomach appeared to be swelling up, but his eyes were sunk deep into his old-looking, lean little face. Gabriel usually carried him, and when they stopped for rest he would nestle down in his grandmother's lap and whine for food. Then Granny would take a few sticks and light a tiny fire. She would put a few drops of water in the pot and place it on the stones and rock Tikla to and fro. "While the food heats we will sing a song of the cooking pot," she would say, and she would sing and talk of days gone by when the grass was green and the oxen drew the plow, when they harvested the maize and the sorghum and the bees swarmed and the birds sang, when they brewed the beer and danced and laughed. In a very short time Tikla's eyes would close and he would fall into a fast, exhausted sleep. He never knew that there was no food in the cooking pot. Yet the first to go was not the hungry victim, for as they skirted small towns they were given enough food to keep them alive, but never enough to satisfy them. Selassie was a brave young little boy, trampling along beside his mother, seldom complaining. Her husband had been killed in a skirmish with the government troops, and her baby had died. Selassie was all she had left. and for his sake she was determined to stay alive. Selassie was a brave young little boy, trampling along beside his mother, seldom complaining. Her husband had been killed in a skirmish with the government troops, and her baby had died. Selassie was all she had left, and for his sake she was determined to stay alive. It was midnight, and they were pressing on over the foothills, trampling the dry brushwood, sometimes whispering words of encouragement to the weary children. Suddenly there was a shrill scream, and a column froze, and there was a rustle in the undergrowth as a snake glided by. It was a night of clouds and very dark, and it took a little while to determine who had uttered that cry, and to catch up with Gabriel and to beg him to return with the lantern. By the time he returned, Selassie's foot was swollen and blue, and although Gabriel cut away the wound with his knife and sucked with all his strength, it was too late. They could not wait. There were too many other children in danger of death if they loitered. A man took Selassie in his arms, and he stumbled on until the sky ahead of them flushed red and saffron above the rolling countryside. The man stopped, and he and the mother gazed down at Selassie's face. It had been twisted with pain before, but now it was suddenly full of peace and alight with the dawn. "He is gone," said the man almost wonderingly, and the old priest who was nearby held up his golden cross. Well, tomorrow we'll start on chapter 6, and I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.